much, Sandy. And um, just a word of caution to some degree. The story of the Irish famine is necessarily a very dark one. Sometimes before stories are told on radio or television, there's a warning that children's ears should be covered, and even some adults in this case, I feel. In any case, my task is to describe what has happened in terms of our understanding of the Irish famine. And I would have to say that the understanding of what happened during the famine is somewhat contested. Like any major event, there are different viewpoints as to what really happened and what is truth. I'd like to think that for this evening's conversation that I've assembled facts, but I've assembled them in a way that certainly it wants to put forward a particular viewpoint, and I don't apologize for that. Anyway, that's just the preface. If you remember, over the last number of weeks, and last week in fact, we looked at the penal laws and how they had stripped Irish Catholics of their rights, including the right to hold any government office, vote, buy land, practice law, attend social, or attend certain events like school, for instance, little things like that. Or even to serve an apprenticeship, possess a weapon, practice their religion. The Catholic Church was outlawed. The Gaelic language was banned. Export trade was forbidden as Irish commerce and industry were deliberately destroyed. While many of these laws were relaxed by 1829, their impact, on top of marked absence of their former natural leaders and the fact that 95% of the land in Ireland was now owned by Protestants, with the Catholic farmers now merely tenants on their land, which was being farmed in ever decreasing divisions. A once proud people were deeply wounded and highly vulnerable at this time. Furthermore, Ireland lost its own parliament in 1801, a British initiative which was to have huge impact on commerce, trade and potential development of industry throughout that century. There was one positive development in Irish agriculture, and that was the introduction of the lumper potato, which thrived in the Irish soil and climate. By 1750, the potato had climatised to the Irish weather, and its use began to be spread particularly to counties along the western seaboard, where the poorest land was farmed, and it was found to be particularly responsive to the use of seaweed as a fertiliser. There had been a successive number of excellent harvests in the early decades of the 19th century, and food was generally plentiful. The population of the country had more than doubled from 4 million to over 8 million people, the vast majority of whom were living off small plots of land. There was a survey carried out in 1835 that showed that 75% of Irish labourers were without steady employment, and that had significance for later on. So on the eve of the famine, around a third of Irish people, concentrated in Munster and Connacht, depended on the potato almost exclusively. As it couldn't be stored or transported well, a new crop had to be grown each year. The precarious landholding of the tenant farmer on parcels of land were just about sustainable when harvests were good. The living conditions of pauperized and highly vulnerable large families was unspeakably primitive and unsanitary. They were mostly described as mud huts of often one-roomed hovels and with very little or no furniture, where straw, when available, was laid on the ground for the family to sleep. One description of an eyewitness, he was an American sea captain and he was coming from Boston. He arrived in the city of Cork in 1847, and he said, "I saw enough in 5 minutes to horrify me. Hovels crowded with sick and dying, without floors, without furniture, and with patches of dirty straw covered with still dirtier shreds and sherds of patches of humanity." Quite a description. And this was not that long ago. These huts, of which there were up to 500,000, it was reckoned, were in use at this time, and they were often very densely located. But they became the private place for dying or dead Irish men, women, and children between the years 1845 and 1852. Earlier, we described a thriving civilization, a Gaelic civilization with amazing innovation, cultured, very well organized, a highly structured society in some respects, and very community-based. And here we are some centuries later. So what happened? The answer to that question is layered and shocking. A potato blight spread from the United States into a number of European countries, but only in one country did it result in national catastrophe. Given that there was complete dependence of at least a third of the population on the nourishment provided by the potato up to now, and its rapid spread to about half of the country's harvest in its first year, this destructive blight impacted the small tenant farmer and farm labourer and their families, who immediately suffered. The potato crop was to continue to fail over the next number of years. Starvation, combined with an increased susceptibility to disease such as typhoid, dysentery, and cholera, devastated this vulnerable population. Another eyewitness in the town of Skibbereen writes, "I entered some of the hovels, and the scenes that presented themselves were such as no tongue or pen can convey the slightest idea of. In the first, six famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw. Their sole covering, what seemed a ragged horsecloth, and their wretched legs hanging about, naked above the knees. I approached in horror and found by a low moaning that they were alive. They were in fever, 4 children, a woman, and what once had been a man." It is impossible to go through the detail. Suffice it to say that in a few minutes I was surrounded by at least 200 of such phantoms, such frightful spectres as no words can describe. By far the greater number were delirious, either from famine or from fever. Their demonic yells are still ringing in my ears, and their horrible images are fixed on my brain. This gentleman's name was Nicholas Cummins, and he was a Justice of the Peace in Cork in 1846. Another account reported by a William Foster. It was William Forster, and he was a Quaker in 1846. He said, "The children were like skeletons, their features sharpened with hunger and their limbs wasted, so that there was little left but bones, their hands and arms in particular being much emaciated, and the happy expression of infancy gone from their faces, leaving the anxious look of premature old age." We have identified a number of factors that ensured that this agricultural disaster had a catastrophic and tragic impact in Ireland. However, it would be remiss of us to ignore many of the inverted commas initiatives that the British government had taken over the previous years that we adverted to earlier. All of these had the desired and accumulated effect of weakening a whole people. Most important of these was probably the system of land ownership that had been intentionally created, that primarily benefited a Protestant landowning class, many of whom didn't even live in the country. And these were administered by unscrupulous middlemen and paid for by the tenant farmer, whose responsibility to pay annual rent to their landlord was a disproportionately huge percentage of their annual income. Administration of the country in Ireland was reduced to what I would describe as messenger boy status, where all significant decisions were taken by an alien political government in London, the Act of Union having assured of that. The first British government response, which was under Prime Minister Robert Peel, was fast and not an unreasonable one, but it was unpopular with his cabinet colleagues. He purchased £100,000 of Indian corn from the United States for direct distribution to Ireland. He also proposed the abolition of the Corn Laws, much to the anger of the landowning classes. This provided for high tariffs for imported grain, thus keeping grain at a high price locally. Early in 1846, as stories of the first deaths from starvation were being reported, he commenced a series of public works to enable the poor to earn sufficient money to purchase the grain. The wages, however, that came from these public works proved to be insufficient to buy food, as prices had soared at that time. Such was the sentiment of the British people of that time that Peel had to resign in the middle of 1846, as his liberal attitude towards relief for victims of the Irish was heavily criticised. A new government, under the premiership of John Russell, was to manage, or more correctly mismanage, the Irish famine until it ended in 1852. This was a government that epitomised the doctrine of non-interference in matters of economics, especially if such interventions might disturb the Protestant landowning classes in Ireland. The government, was also captivated by a mindset which was the acceptance of providence, And if the wisdom of Providence meant that thousands of Irish Catholic peasants were to die of starvation and disease, then so be it. Charles Trevelyan, the Under-Secretary in the British Treasury, was charged with oversight of the famine relief in Ireland on this new administration. And on assuming his office, he immediately ordered the about turn of a ship that had set sail from England carrying grain for relief in Ireland and return to its English port. Later he wrote, "For numerous people like the Irish to be fed from foreign countries is a thing unheard of." However, the government did agree to the construction of 130 workhouses where the most desperate of the famine victims could be assisted. As a matter of policy, these institutions were purposely designed to be very harsh environments where families were separated from one another. Food was limited and work was very arduous. They didn't wish these places to be a temptation for what might be described as lazy Irish. These workhouses became completely overcrowded and were a significant source of disease, where the death carts visited daily to transport the unfortunate inmates. In February 1847, the government was forced to provide for soup kitchens for the starving destitute, albeit on a temporary basis. And at one stage, these kitchens were feeding up to 3 million people per day. Very successful. They then proceeded to abolish this successful initiative by September of that year, as it was seen to clash with the policy and mindset of laissez-faire. Again, Charles Trevelyan states that he was of the opinion that the only way to prevent the people from becoming habitually dependent on government is to bring the food depots to a close. The uncertainty about the next new crop only makes this even more necessary. Some charitable organisations, such as the Quakers, attempted to fill this gap. It was this policy of laissez-faire that also resulted in food exports being allowed to continue where the population starved. They changed the operation of the Poor Laws, whereby from August of that year all financing of famine relief would fall on the local rates, which were increased. This eventually led to landlords engaging in mass evictions of their non-rent paying tenants who were too weak to resist, and this contributed to a substantial increase in death as well as emigration of these dispossessed, starving peasants. There was no attempt at government level to prevent these abominable evictions at this time, which had such lethal consequences. And it is estimated that 500,000 people were evicted over a 5 to 6 year period. It's important to state that it was never a question of insufficient food being available in Ireland, as records show that there certainly was. There was no will on the part of the British to arrange for any meaningful or effective distribution of this available food. It's not unreasonable to say that Irish Catholics at that time were despised by the British elite, and they were actually viewed as less than human. Their plight was responded to with disgust and shocking levels of indifference to the suffering of these people. In fact, in the opinion of many evangelical English Protestants, the Irish were deserving of the horrors of famine that had fallen on them, and as they stubbornly adhered to their idolatrous faith, they deserved this fate. The devastation and misery was seen as an act of divine providence, and therefore did not require intervention by the richest and most powerful empire in the world at that time. The highly influential Illustrated Punch publications often carried cartoons showing civilized John Bull, an Englishman, addressing a monkey-faced Irishman with belittling contempt and comments on how ungrateful such people were for English generosity. It's estimated that over 1 million people died of starvation and disease. 1 million people. Well over 1 million sought refuge through immigration, often on overcrowded ships. These were known as coffin ships, where many were to die on their journey to the United States, Canada, and Australia, as well as to England. Not only did these refugees carry disease, illiteracy, and suffering with them, they were also to carry bitterness and anger towards the British government, and this they passed on as their folk memory that remains to this day. It has been described as the worst famine in Western Europe, having regard to the portion of population that actually died. How the survivors in Ireland coped with the nightmare of famine that had caused so much death and population loss is for another story. But it's clear that they fully understood that they were not among the chosen people. Thank you.